He announced it in front of everyone. I stood there at the front of the conference room, still holding the presentation clicker in my trembling hand, my heart pounding so hard I thought everyone could hear it. "After careful consideration," Mr. Harrison said, straightening his expensive tie with that practiced gesture I had seen 1,000 times, "we've decided to promote Eli instead. He just has the leadership spark we're looking for." The room erupted into polite applause. Eli looked embarrassed, his face flushing red, but not nearly embarrassed enough to refuse the position. My slides were still glowing on the screen behind me, full of data and projections I had spent 3 months compiling, analyzing, and perfecting. My idea, my research, my late nights and early mornings, my entire strategy that had increased our client retention by 42%. I felt my stomach drop like an elevator with cut cables, my hands shaking so badly around the clicker that I had to grip it with both palms to keep it from falling. The same man who had told me 6 months ago, "You're the future of this company, Charlotte," was now deliberately avoiding my eyes. I forced a smile that I could feel cracking halfway through. The meeting ended with handshakes and congratulations directed at Eli while I stood frozen near the door, trying to figure out how to exit gracefully without showing how completely shattered I felt inside. Mr. Harrison caught me in the hallway as everyone else filtered back to their desks, chattering excitedly about the announcement. "Charlotte, wait a moment," he said, that familiar syrupy tone coating his words like cheap honey. I stopped, turned, and waited for whatever explanation he thought would make this betrayal acceptable. "Don't take it personally," he continued, his hand landing on my shoulder in what he probably thought was a comforting gesture. "You're talented, incredibly talented, but you're just not leadership material yet. You need more seasoning, more presence. Eli has that natural charisma that inspires teams." I nodded mechanically, my throat too tight to form words, holding back the sting building behind my eyes. Leadership material. I had led every major project for the past 2 years. I had trained half the current team. I had created systems that the entire department now relied on, but apparently none of that counted as leadership. "I understand," I managed to whisper, though I didn't understand at all. When everyone finally left for the day, I sat alone at my desk in the dimming office, staring at the small plaque that said Employee of the Quarter from 3 months ago. The cleaning crew moved through the space around me, emptying trash bins and vacuuming under desks, barely noticing my presence. Leadership material. The phrase kept echoing in my head, twisting and reshaping itself into something uglier with each repetition. I opened my computer and began methodically deleting files, not the official company work, but the extra resources I had built over the years. The template systems I had created for faster proposal generation. The client relationship database I had organized in my own time. The training materials I had developed to help new hires get up to speed. All the things I had built because I cared about making the company better, the things that existed in my personal folders because I had created them beyond my job description. If they weren't going to value what I contributed, they certainly didn't deserve my extra innovations. The satisfaction of watching those files disappear into the digital void was small but real. That night, I sat on my apartment couch with a glass of cheap wine, scrolling mindlessly through job listings that all seemed to blur together into one monotonous stream of requirements and corporate jargon. Marketing manager, senior strategist, account director. Every listing felt wrong, like trying on clothes that were the right size but completely the wrong style. I had spent 5 years building someone else's dream, making someone else rich, advancing someone else's reputation. And what had it got me? A pat on the head and a dismissal disguised as gentle mentoring. Then, somewhere between my second and third glass of wine, a thought hit me with the clarity of lightning splitting a dark sky. Why was I still begging for a seat at a table I had helped build? Why was I scrolling through listings to work for another person who might do the exact same thing? I had the skills, the experience, the client relationships, and the strategic knowledge. What I didn't have was permission. And maybe, just maybe, I didn't need it anymore. I grabbed a napkin from my coffee table and found a pen in my bag. With shaking hands, I started sketching. A logo, simple and clean, with my own name as the foundation. Charlotte Lane. Lane Strategies. I whispered it aloud for the first time, and the sound of it in my empty apartment felt both terrifying and absolutely perfect. It was insane. I had no funding, no business plan, no safety net. I had student loans and rent and a car payment. Starting a company from nothing, competing in an industry where I knew how brutal the competition could be, was objectively reckless. But sitting there on my worn-out couch, staring at the napkin with my scribbled logo, I felt something I hadn't felt in months, actual, genuine excitement about my future. Not anxiety about pleasing a boss or meeting someone else's expectations, but pure creative possibility. The fear was still there, coiled in my stomach like a sleeping snake, but underneath it was something stronger. Determination. Maybe even a little bit of anger, the productive kind that fuels action rather than just bitterness. I walked into Mr. Harrison's office the next morning with my resignation letter printed on clean white paper, my hands surprisingly steady despite my racing heart. He looked up from his computer with mild surprise. "Charlotte, good morning. What can I do for you?" I placed the letter on his desk without ceremony. He picked it up, scanned it, and his expression shifted from confusion to shock. "You're resigning. Charlotte, if this is about yesterday's announcement, I really think you're being too hasty." Leaving immediately after a disappointment looks impulsive, unprofessional. Think this through carefully. I smiled, and this time it didn't crack at all. It felt genuine, powerful, liberating. "Oh, I have thought it through, Mr. Harrison, very carefully." He started to say something else, probably another attempt to convince me that staying in a place that didn't value me was somehow in my best interest, but I was already walking toward the door. "I'll finish out my 2 weeks, of course." Professional to the end. The look on his face as I left was worth every moment of fear I felt about the enormous leap I was taking into the unknown. I moved my small desk into my apartment living room, positioning it near the window where natural light streamed in during morning hours. My office was laughably modest, a second-hand desk, my personal laptop, and a determination that felt bigger than the tiny space could contain. My first client was Marcus, a friend from a project I had worked on 2 years ago at a different company. He needed help with a marketing campaign for his small restaurant chain and had a limited budget. I charged him barely enough to cover my immediate expenses, knowing I needed the experience and the portfolio piece more than I needed the money. But despite the cramped workspace and the financial uncertainty, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. I felt alive again. Every decision was mine. Every success would be genuinely earned. Every failure would be a lesson I chose to learn. The weight of someone else's judgment, someone else's approval, had been lifted from my shoulders. I worked late into the nights, not because someone was demanding it, but because I was genuinely excited about what I was building. The campaign I developed for Marcus's restaurants was simple but strategic, targeted social media content, local influencer partnerships, and community engagement events that felt authentic rather than corporate. 3 weeks after launch, his customer traffic had increased dramatically. He was so thrilled that he posted a public thank you on his business page, tagging my new company name and praising the work I had done. The post got shared dozens of times by his customers and other local business owners. Comments poured in asking about marketing services. And then, while I was reading through the responses late one night, I noticed something that made me laugh out loud in my empty apartment. Eli had liked the post. Eli, who had got my promotion, who supposedly had that leadership spark, was watching what I was doing. The petty part of me felt vindicated. The professional part of me realized this meant word was spreading. People were noticing Lane's strategies. My tiny, living room-based company was becoming visible, and I had done it in less than a month of actual operation. Old coworkers started messaging me through LinkedIn and personal emails. "Charlotte, I heard you left. Are you really starting your own company? How's it going? I've been thinking about making a change too. I can't believe you actually did it." I responded to each message honestly, sharing both the excitement and the challenges, the late nights and the uncertainty. When people expressed envy or wishfulness about leaving their own unsatisfying positions, I told them the truth. You can do this too. It's scary, but it's possible. My words seemed to plant seeds. About 6 weeks after I left, I heard through the grapevine that 2 people from my old department had resigned. One was pursuing a different career entirely. The other was starting freelance consulting work. Mr. Harrison was apparently furious, seeing my departure as the beginning of some kind of rebellion or mass exodus. I hadn't intended to start a movement. but I wasn't sorry that my choice had given others permission to examine their own situations and make changes that served them better. Sometimes the most radical thing you can do is simply demonstrate that alternative paths exist. A former company client reached out through my website's contact form. The message was careful, almost cautious. "Hi, Charlotte. I hope this email finds you well. We worked together on the Henderson campaign last year. You were the strategist on that project, correct?" I confirmed, being equally careful not to say anything that could be construed as poaching or badmouthing my former employer. They asked if we could meet for coffee to discuss potential opportunities. My heart raced as I typed my response agreeing to the meeting. This was a major client, the kind that could transform my fledgling company from a living room operation into something substantial. We met at a quiet cafe downtown, and they were direct about their frustrations. "The quality dropped after you left. Projects are delayed. Communication is poor. We've been unhappy for weeks now." They wanted to know if I would be interested in taking over their account. This was the moment I had to decide. Was I ready to directly compete with my former employer? Was I comfortable potentially taking business that had been theirs? I thought about Mr. Harrison's dismissive words, about being told I wasn't leadership material, about watching my work advance someone else's career. "Yes," I said clearly. "I would be very interested in working with you." I drove past my old office building one afternoon while running errands, and something new caught my eye. A large banner had been hung across the front entrance. "Leadership starts here," in bold letters, with Mr. Harrison's professional headshot prominently displayed underneath. It was clearly a response to losing clients and employees, an attempt to reassert authority and inspire confidence. I sat in my car at the traffic light, staring at that banner, and something unexpected happened. I started laughing. Not the bitter, angry laugh of someone seeking revenge, but genuine, free laughter that bubbled up from somewhere deep in my chest. The desperation visible in that banner, the obvious insecurity it revealed, it was almost sad. They were worried. They were scrambling, and I was just beginning. The light turned green and I drove away, still smiling, feeling lighter than I had in years. I wasn't competing out of spite anymore. I was simply building something better, something that reflected my actual values and vision. The fact that it made my former employer nervous was just a side effect, not the goal. The client who had reached out during that careful coffee meeting officially signed a contract with Lane Strategies. It was my first major deal, the kind with enough budget to cover actual business expenses, maybe even hire help eventually. I celebrated that night in my apartment with instant noodles eaten at my kitchen table desk, and it felt more satisfying than any fancy restaurant meal I had eaten during company celebrations at my old job. This success was entirely mine. I had earned it through my skills, my reputation, and my genuine care about delivering quality work. For the first time since starting this terrifying journey, I didn't feel small or overwhelmed or like I was pretending to be something I wasn't. I felt capable. I felt legitimate. The imposter syndrome that had whispered constantly in my ear during my corporate years, telling me I was lucky to have my position, that I needed to be grateful for opportunities, that I should accept whatever scraps of recognition came my way. That voice was finally getting quieter. Maybe I actually was leadership material after all, just not the kind Mr. Harrison recognized or valued. A friend who still worked at my old company called me one evening. Her voice low, like she was worried about being overheard even though she was calling from home. "Charlotte, I shouldn't be telling you this, but I thought you'd want to know. Things are falling apart here. Morale is terrible. We've missed 3 major deadlines in the past month. Eli is completely overwhelmed." She explained that projects I used to manage smoothly were now disorganized and chaotic. The systems I had built were breaking down without someone who understood how to maintain them. Eli, despite his supposed leadership spark, was discovering that charisma couldn't replace actual competence and experience. He was working late every night, stressed and struggling, trying to fill shoes that apparently fit better than Mr. Harrison had anticipated. I felt a complicated mix of emotions hearing this. Part of me, the petty, hurt part, felt vindicated, but mostly I just felt sad about the waste of it all. If they had simply promoted based on merit instead of whatever unconscious bias had led them to value Eli's spark over my proven track record, everyone would have been better off. Now they were scrambling, clients were unhappy, and Eli was probably miserable in a role he wasn't ready for. I attended a local business networking event downtown, the kind of casual mixer where entrepreneurs and professionals exchanged cards and made small talk over cheap wine and cheese cubes. I was chatting with a potential client when I felt someone's presence beside me. I turned, and there was Mr. Harrison, his smile faltering visibly when he saw my name badge. Charlotte Lane, founder and CEO, Lane Strategies. His eyes scanned the badge twice, like he needed to confirm what he was reading. "Oh, Charlotte," he said with forced casualness. "So this is your little project. I heard you were doing some freelance work." Something in his tone, the deliberate diminishment of calling it a project, sparked a quiet anger that I kept carefully controlled. I smiled, meeting his eyes directly. "No, Mr. Harrison, it's not a project. It's my company." The distinction hung in the air between us. He opened his mouth, closed it, then excused himself with a mumbled comment about needing to speak to someone across the room. I watched him walk away, his shoulders slightly hunched, and realized something important. I didn't need his approval anymore. His opinion of me, his assessment of my capabilities, none of it mattered. I was succeeding despite his limitations, not because I had finally earned his validation. Word got back to me through multiple sources that Mr. Harrison was asking questions about my business. How many clients did I have? Who was I working with? What kind of services was I offering? The questions were framed as casual curiosity, but everyone who reported them to me understood what they really represented. He was threatened. My small company, barely 3 months old and operating out of my apartment, had gotten under his skin. He had dismissed me as not ready for leadership, and now I was demonstrating exactly the kind of strategic thinking and client relationship management that defined good leadership. The irony was almost poetic. I didn't gloat about this information when people shared it with me. Instead, I just smiled and kept working. Every hour I spent obsessing over his reaction would be an hour I wasn't spending building something meaningful. Revenge, I was learning, wasn't about destruction or proving someone wrong. It was about building something so undeniably successful that the contrast spoke for itself. Let him ask questions. Let him wonder and worry. I had more important things to focus on, like the 3 new client proposals sitting on my desk waiting for my attention. A certified letter arrived at my apartment one Tuesday morning. Inside was a cease and desist letter from a law firm representing my former company, claiming that I was inappropriately poaching their clients and potentially violating non-compete clauses in my employment contract. My hands shook as I read through the legal language, the implied threats, the demands that I immediately cease all contact with any clients I had known through my previous employment. I called my cousin Kyle, who happened to be a contract lawyer, and sent him photos of the letter. He called me back 20 minutes later, and I could hear the laughter in his voice. "Charlotte, this is complete garbage. You're not violating anything. You didn't sign a non-compete. I remember reviewing your employment contract when you first took that job. And clients have the right to choose who they work with. He's just trying to scare you." I felt relief flood through my body, replacing the cold fear that had gripped me since opening that envelope. So I don't need to respond. You can respond politely through a lawyer if you want to cover yourself, but honestly, he's bluffing. This is intimidation, nothing more. I framed the letter and hung it on my apartment wall, right above my desk. Not as a threat, but as a reminder. Every time someone tried to keep me small, it just proved I was growing too big to ignore. I hired my first official employee 4 months after starting Lane Strategies. Her name was Raina, and she had been one of the best analysts at my former company, detail-oriented, creative, and consistently undervalued. When I reached out to ask if she'd be interested in joining my company, there was a long pause on the phone before she responded. "I've been waiting for you to ask," she said quietly. "I've been waiting for a chance to work for someone who actually listens, who values the work more than office politics." We met for coffee to discuss logistics, salary, and vision. I was honest about the risks. We were still a small operation. There was no guarantee of stability, and she would be giving up benefits and security for uncertainty. She listened to everything I said, then smiled. "Charlotte, I watched what you built there for years. I watched them take credit for your work and then tell you that you weren't ready to lead. If you're building something different, something better, I want to be part of it." When she left that coffee shop as my first official employee, I sat in my car and cried. Not from sadness, but from overwhelming gratitude and the sudden realization that I was actually doing this. I was building a company, creating jobs, offering others an alternative to the toxic environment we had both escaped. Local business publications started noticing what was happening in our small city's marketing industry. An article appeared in the Weekly Business Journal with the headline, "Small Startup Disrupts Local Marketing Landscape." The article featured quotes from several clients about the personalized service and innovative strategies they were receiving from newer, smaller firms compared to the established agencies. My company was mentioned by name, with a photo of me working at my desk. The article also mentioned my former employer, noting that they had recently experienced significant client turnover and internal restructuring. The piece wasn't deliberately cruel, but the comparison was clear and implicit. Smaller, more agile companies were outperforming the old guard by being more responsive, more creative, and more genuinely invested in client success. Several people sent me screenshots of the article, some with congratulations, others with barely concealed glee at the comparison. I read it once, allowed myself a moment of satisfaction, then moved on to my actual work. The article was nice, but it was also just one moment. The real work was in sustaining this success, in continuing to deliver results that would make such comparisons inevitable rather than noteworthy. My contact network provided regular updates about the deteriorating situation at my former company. The board was apparently furious about declining profits and the string of clients who had left for competitors, not just for my company, but for several others as well. Projects were consistently running over budget and past deadlines. Eli had resigned from his leadership position after just 5 months, unable to handle the pressure and complexity of responsibilities he hadn't been prepared for. Mr. Harrison was now personally managing many of the major accounts, working long hours and visibly stressed in every interaction. I felt no joy hearing about these struggles. The vindictive satisfaction I might have expected never materialized. Instead, I mostly felt sad about the unnecessary waste of it all. If ego and bias hadn't interfered with good judgment, none of this had to happen. Eli could have grown into leadership gradually with proper mentoring. I could have contributed at a higher level while staying with the company. Clients could have received consistent, quality service. Everyone lost when pride and prejudice shaped business decisions. But those weren't my problems to solve anymore. I had my own company to run, my own clients to serve, my own team to build. An email appeared in my inbox with Mr. Harrison's name in the sender field. The subject line read simply, "Lunch." The message was brief and carefully casual. "Charlotte, I hope you're well. I'd like to meet for lunch sometime soon to talk. No hard feelings, just a conversation between professionals. Let me know if you're available." I stared at that email for a long time, trying to decode the actual meaning behind the words. Finally, curiosity won out over caution. I agreed to meet him at a neutral restaurant downtown the following week. When I arrived, he was already seated at a corner table, looking noticeably older and more tired than he had just 6 months ago. The confidence and smugness that had always characterized his demeanor seemed diminished. We ordered food and made awkward small talk about the weather and local business news. Then he finally got to the real point. "Charlotte, you're really building something impressive. I've been watching, and I have to admit, I underestimated what you were capable of creating on your own." He paused, seeming to measure his next words carefully. "I wanted to talk to you about a proposition." Mr. Harrison leaned forward, his expression earnest in a way that felt practiced, calculated. "What if we joined forces again? Not as employer and employee, obviously, but as partners. I could bring you back as a full partner in the firm. We'd combine your fresh energy and client relationships with our established infrastructure and resources. Together, we could dominate this market." I sipped my coffee, taking time to process what he was actually proposing. He wanted to absorb my company, to bring me back into his structure where he would still ultimately control the direction and decisions. The word partner sounded nice, but I had learned enough about business to know that partnership terms mattered enormously. Who had final say? Who owned what percentage? Whose name was on the door? "You didn't want a partner 6 months ago," I said calmly, setting down my coffee cup. "You wanted ownership of my work without giving me authority or recognition." That's very different from actual partnership. His face tightened. Charlotte, be realistic. You're doing well now, but sustaining a small business long-term is incredibly difficult. This is a generous offer. I stood up, leaving cash on the table for my portion of the bill. Thank you for lunch, Mr. Harrison, but I'm not interested. I walked away without shaking his hand, feeling lighter with each step toward the door. 3 months after that lunch meeting, Lane Strategies moved into an actual office space. A beautiful, light-filled suite just 1 block away from my former employer's building. We had grown to a team of 5, with enough steady clients to justify the overhead of real office space. The office had big glass windows that let in natural light, an open floor plan that encouraged collaboration, and an atmosphere that felt warm and welcoming rather than competitive and tense. Local professionals started referring to my company as the better version when comparing us to the established firms. That description felt like the ultimate validation, not just that we were succeeding, but that we represented something different, something improved. We were building the kind of workplace culture that valued actual contribution over office politics, that promoted based on merit rather than bias, that treated employees like valuable humans rather than replaceable resources. Raina brought in a plant for the office, and somehow that simple gesture felt symbolic. We were building something living, growing, sustainable. Not just a business, but a vision for how professional spaces could operate differently. Every client meeting, every successful project, every satisfied team member felt like proof that the alternative path I had chosen was not just viable, but actually superior to what I had left behind. Word spread fast through the local business community. My former employer had lost their single biggest client, a major account that represented almost 30% of their annual revenue. That client had chosen Lane Strategies instead. I heard the news through a client who mentioned it casually during a meeting, not realizing the significance. Yeah, everyone's talking about how Harrison and Associates is really struggling now. I heard they might have to close one of their offices. 2 months later, I drove past my old building and saw a for lease sign in the window. They had shuttered the location entirely, unable to sustain operations with their diminished client base and reputation. There was no scandal, no dramatic fight, no public conflict that could be pointed to as the cause of their downfall. Just silence and the inevitable consequences of poor leadership, undervalued employees, and decisions driven by ego rather than wisdom. I felt no triumph looking at that empty building, no satisfaction in their failure. Mostly, I felt a quiet kind of sadness about the unnecessary waste. If they had simply recognized talent and built people up instead of tearing them down, everyone could have succeeded. But they made their choices, and I had made mine. We celebrated Lane Strategies' 1-year anniversary with a party at our office that overflowed with clients, friends, former colleagues, and well-wishers. The space was filled with laughter, conversation, and a genuine sense of community that I had never experienced in corporate settings. People kept approaching me throughout the evening to share their own stories about toxic workplaces they had left, dreams they were pursuing, risks they were taking because they had seen me do it first. Through the glass windows, I could see the old building across the street, still empty, a shell of what it had once been. I raised my glass during a quiet moment, looking around at the people who had believed in this vision, who had taken chances on a company that started in someone's living room. To everyone here, I said, my voice carrying across the room. To what happens when you stop asking for permission and start building what you know is possible, to recognizing your own worth, to taking the leap. The room erupted in cheers and applause, and in that moment, I felt completely, genuinely successful. Not because I had beaten my former employer, but because I had created something meaningful. Now, 2 years after that devastating meeting where I was told I wasn't leadership material, I spend significant time mentoring other professionals, particularly women who feel overlooked, undervalued, or stuck in positions where their contributions aren't recognized. They reach out through LinkedIn, through mutual connections, through business networking events, asking the same questions I once asked myself. How did you know it was the right time? How did you handle the fear? What if I fail? I meet them for coffee and share my story honestly, including the terrifying parts, the mistakes I made, the nights I couldn't sleep because I was worried about money. But I also share the freedom, the satisfaction, the incredible feeling of building something that reflects your actual values and vision. When they ask how I started, I smile and tell them the truth. I was told I wasn't leadership material, I say. So I became the kind of leader I needed, someone who recognizes talent, who values contribution over politics, who builds people up instead of keeping them small. My former boss denied my promotion because he couldn't see past his own biases about what leadership looked like. So I started my own company next door and let my results do the talking. Turns out, the quiet ones don't stay quiet forever. Sometimes, they just need permission to recognize their own power. And sometimes, you have to give yourself that permission.